All right. This is chapter 19. 17, 18, 19, and 20 all deal with the same period, basically. The later half of the 19th century. And they merely address different aspects of that. So in chapter 17, we talked about what was going on in the Western territories. In chapter 18, we talked about industrialization. In chapter 19, we're going to talk about life in the later part of the 19th century. Immigration, urbanization, and everyday life and culture. Chapter 20, we'll talk about the politics of it, and we'll obviously address that when we get to chapter 20. But this chapter is going to talk about life and what made life interesting in the later half of the 19th century. So you see the most obvious change in everyday life, meaning visual change in everyday life in the cities, which all grew spectacularly once industrialization really took hold in the later half of the 19th century. This growth fueled by immigration from both the countryside and immigration abroad. Industry produced a demand for new workers, which attracted those people to the cities and in turn grew the cities. Good wages and a variety of jobs attracted people from various places, both the countryside, like I say, and abroad. Young women pretty much led the exodus as mechanization made farming increasingly male-dominated work. And the same things attracted European immigrants, including a growing number of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia especially. These are known as pull factors, the idea that you would get higher wages, better variety, things like that. Those are things that are pulling you into the cities. Other factors like overpopulation, in Europe especially, crop failure, religious persecution, violence, industrial depression, all of these make up collectively push factors, things that are pushing you away from your current place of residence. If we're talking about domestic immigration from the countryside to the city, mechanization of farming, which essentially pushed young women into industrial work. That's an example of domestic push factors. All of these things, both push and pull factors, motivated a lot of the immigrants to make the journey to American industry. Most immigrants tended to settle in cities in the Northeast and the North Central states. By 1890, about 4/5 of the people in New York City were foreign-born or first-generation Americans. Many were single young men, and there were a few single young women who came on their own to America. All of them faced a physical exam once they arrived, and at least a few of them were deported if they were found to have physical handicaps or contagious diseases. If they passed, their names were then recorded and often anglicized if they proved to be too difficult to either pronounce or spell. And so for this reason, you have a lot of immigrants that say they come from Poland or the Czech Republic or something like that, or Czechoslovakia, I suppose, at the time. And they will have very un-Polish or un-Czech sounding names. And the reason for that is because they got anglicized when they came here. In the cities, immigrants quite often clustered together in order to ease the stress of adjusting to a new life. Some groups managed to adjust much easier than other groups. The Irish in America, for example, facilitated the adjustment for newbies through their domination of democratic politics in the cities. And the hierarchy of the Catholic Church also helped establish new Irish immigrants. Domination by one group often made adjustment harder for other groups. However, discrimination also helped to create a common ethnic identity for these groups. Not everyone who came to America intended to stay, and so there were at least a few who made very little effort to assimilate. These were the people who were more often than not single young men who had come over to America, the goal being to make enough money in their savings so that they could go back home and buy property of some sort. However, these people were few and far between. Generally speaking, those that came to America as immigrants came with the intention to stay and make a life in America. Excuse me. As the number of immigrants grew, all immigrants began facing growing hostility from the white, native-born American population, who feared the loss of their privilege and status. And so you see a resurgence of nativism again in this later period, in the same way that you did in the sort of 1830s, when we had a wave of Irish and German immigration. All the major cities had sort of rundown, overcrowded slum areas where immigrants tended to congregate. They were usually close to manufacturing districts and developed when landlords subdivided buildings into tenements that would allow them to cram as many people as humanly possible into a relatively small space. The slums became ghettos when laws, prejudice, or community pressure, or some combination of the three, prevented the inhabitants from renting or residing elsewhere. Life tended to be very difficult for children. Disease quite often took its toll, and infant mortality was very high. The tenements themselves also tended to be noisy, polluted, and smelly, much like the general slum area was smelly and polluted and noisy. Immigrants only stayed in the slums as long as they had to until they could afford to move to a nicer location. For some immigrant families, that may be never, and for others, that may be relatively quickly. By contrast, black workers were often trapped in segregated districts, usually only given menial work with very low pay, high rents, real estate covenants, and other neighborhood pressures often kept them out of the nicer districts, even without specifically stated laws to do so. They didn't usually have enough political clout either to overcome these campaigns to shut them out, and so they were sort of stuck. Right next to the slums, one could also find neighborhoods of exceptional opulence, often sporting the latest technologies. People began moving to the suburbs, however, in the 1870s and 80s. Promoters of the suburbs contrasted the rolling lawns and stately homes with the overflowing tenements, crowded streets, and noisy entertainments that characterize city living. The middle class followed the precedent of the upper class and very quickly moved to the burbs in this period. The pattern of informal residential segregation by income began to take hold, and people could identify the average income of a neighborhood often by what the houses looked like. The introduction of easy transportation methods like streetcars and trains exploded the cities outward, where they swallowed up nearby suburbs that were already sort of long-standing, so that those suburbs eventually kind of became part of the city, much to the chagrin of the residents. Often described as a land of contrasts, these places were places where you could separate social groups and dissimilar living conditions between the rich and the poor, and you see heightened ethnic, racial, as well as class divisions existing in these areas as well. Often spared the struggle for survival that confronted most Americans following the Civil War, the middle and upper classes faced a different set of challenges, and that ultimately became characterized by the question of how to rationalize their enjoyment of products that came to characterize the emerging consumer society that was essentially American society. Victorian morality was the sort of term used to describe a set of social ideas that were embraced by the privileged classes of England and America during the reign of Queen Victoria, and often sort of following in the example of Queen Victoria as well. The argument was made that The financial success of the middle and upper classes arose from their superior talent, intelligence, morality, and self control. And these sorts of things were used to both encourage and differentiate themselves from the working classes. There are several fundamental assumptions made which shaped the Victorian worldview, and the first of these was that human nature was malleable, that people could work to improve themselves. The second of these was that work had some social value. Working hard not only developed self discipline, but also helped to advance the progress of the nation generally. And finally, that good manners and the cultivation of literature and art served to ennoble a society. Manners and these three assumptions that sort of made up this ideal were held up as sort of universal standards for everyone to strive towards. Victorians tended to stress the importance of manners and social rituals, especially, including the knowledge of dining and entertaining etiquette, good posture, and all of these things became the mark of a certain status. The Victorian Code, with its emphasis on morals and manners and proper behavior, also tended to heighten the sense of class differences and created visible distinction among various social groups. The Victorian views on morality and culture, coupled with the need to make decisions about a mountain of domestic products, had a subtle but important effect on middle class expectations, especially those revolving around a woman's role within the home. From the 1840s, you had the introduction of the sort of separate spheres, the idea of the home being the woman's sphere. And the home was supposed to be this sort of retreat, a place where women could express their maternal gifts, including child care, aptitude for religion and morality, and so on. Moving forward to the 1880s and 1890s, Victorian advocates morphed this into the idea of the cult of domesticity. They also added a new obligation to foster an artistic environment that would nurture the family's cultural improvement. Houses essentially became statements of cultural aspiration and involved elegant furnishings, art, literature, music, those sorts of cultural enhancements that could better the family. Not all middle-class women pursued this domestic ideal. For some, just getting everything done around the house was a full-time job. And for others, the artistic ideal wasn't particularly to their taste. But as middle and upper class women sought out other outlets for their creative energies in reform measures like settlement house work and women's clubs and things like that, older domestic ideals also begin to unravel, especially as we get closer to the 20th century, to the turn of the century. Victorian social thought justified the privileges of the well-to-do, but many people found it very difficult to shake the sort of thriftiness that tended to characterize the earlier years. In order to lure these reluctant consumers, merchandisers in the 1880s stressed high quality, low cost, encouraged Americans to loosen their purse strings and enjoy prosperity without reservations. And this particularly appealed to women who were in charge of providing for their families and now had to shop for goods for the household, things like soap and canned goods and other products that they used to make at home more often than not. Department stores became the sort of standard for consumption in America. These stores advertised rock bottom prices and engaged in price wars. They usually involved giant storefront windows where they would put up extravagant displays in order to entice consumers to come inside and look around and spend their money. Department stores made shopping an exciting activity. something that could be looked forward to, and something that could be a social activity as well. The rapid turnover of merchandise also created a sense of constant novelty, so that there was always new products to pick from, and so it was always kind of a new adventure every time you went. The department stores themselves also featured luxurious accommodations, if you like. There were stained glass windows, skylights, marble staircases, chandeliers, plush carpets, everything that made the stores look high end and luxurious, and sort of pandered to wealthy aspirations, I suppose you could say. The stores also functioned as a workplace for the lower classes, and a social club for the more comfortably fixed women of the middle and upper classes, and basically a form of entertainment for them as well. So, colleges and universities represented sort of the last bastion of business and professional elite. Capitalists would gain status, and sometimes a sense of immortality through their large endowments. They would also dominate the boards of trustees of most institutions, and so were able to make important decisions as to the running of the institutions themselves. Classroom experience was combined with social groups and athletic activities in order to prepare affluent young men for later responsibilities in business. Football rose to special prominence. However, a lot of college presidents dismissed it as a dangerous waste of time and money. And in fact, the president of Harvard, I believe, quipped at one point that BA no longer stood for Bachelor of Arts, but rather Bachelor of Athletics, as his kind of way of bemoaning the growth and popularity of football, sort of at the expense of academics. Eager alumni, as well as coaches, were very quick to defend the sport, however, and praised it as character building. It essentially functioned as a sort of surrogate to the frontier experience, which was, of course, diminishing rather quickly as the frontier itself diminished. More than 150 new institutions were founded between 1880 and 1900, and enrollments more than doubled. Industrialists endowed some of these new institutions, while others, like state universities especially, were financed with public funds through the Morrill Land Grant Act, which had been passed during the Civil War. Still others were founded by religious organizations. Co-ed private and public universities in the Midwest began enrolling growing numbers of women in their programs. In the East, colleges like Harvard enrolled women in affiliated, albeit separate, institutions as well. And some colleges were founded especially for women, like Smith or Radcliffe. The most prominent of these, there was actually 7 of them eventually, and they were called collectively the Seven Sisters, named after the constellation and its associated Greek myth, the Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters. Women who were educated in these institutions developed the confidence to sort of break with the ideal of passive womanhood, and these were the ones that would grow to make the more prominent changes that characterize the women's movement of the early 20th century as well. Innovative university presidents, also influenced by new discoveries in science, shifted the focus of higher education. The Civil War especially exposed the dismal state of American medicine. In the 1880s and 90s, leading medical professors began restructuring medical education in America. They insisted that all medical students be trained in biology, chemistry, and physics, and spend some quota of time in the lab. Improved healthcare in some areas, or it helped to improve healthcare in some areas anyways, but also effectively shut out a lot of lower socioeconomic class Americans, as well as African Americans and poor women who could not afford the extended tuition for medical training. You also see a new rise or a new type of institution in America, the sort of research University. These universities would offer courses in a wide variety of subject areas. They would often establish professional schools and encourage faculty to pursue basic research. And so it became synonymous with college faculty that you would also be required to do research and to publish your findings and things like that. The new conception of higher education laid the groundwork for the central role that institutions like these would play in the intellectual, cultural, and scientific life of the 20th century, which is only just dawning. Stunned by the levels of poverty in the expanding industrial cities, middle-class city leaders sought comprehensive solutions to relieve poverty. They believed immigrants lacked self-discipline and their unsanitary living conditions caused problems, and so focused on moral improvement and exposing the sort of squalid state of tenement housing. It was only later that settlement house workers began to examine the crippling impact of things like low wages and dangerous working conditions on poverty in industrial cities. Campaigns in this period, though, to help the destitute were often turned into missions to Americanize and eliminate customs they saw as offensive and self-destructive, chiefly aimed at immigrants. They first targeted the young by starting charities to help transient youths and abandoned street children, but this sort of voluntaristic approach was supplemented by more coercive tactics. They would establish dorms, reading rooms, workshops to teach practical skills and things like that. In the 1880s, a younger generation of reformers, led by a lady called Jane Addams, developed a new method to combat destitution, and this became known as the settlement house. These houses in America were modeled off of earlier such attempts in England, and the one that Addams officially opened was Hull House, and it was established in Chicago in 1889 and became a center for immigrants, a kind of neighborhood community center for immigrants. Workers in settlement houses recognized that the hardships of slum life were quite often beyond the individual's control, and so rather than a sort of moralistic approach, they chose to do things that addressed, I guess, kind of the symptoms of poverty, and in some ways as well, the causes of it. They would sponsor plays, art projects. They would hold English classes for those who had limited proficiency, civics classes to sort of teach public policy and public affairs, cooking and sewing classes. They established a kindergarten, laundry, employment bureau, nursery, various services for the immigrant population. In 1895, there were at least 50 settlement houses operating around the nation. In their efforts to promote class cooperation and social harmony, the houses had some mixed results. A lot of immigrants appreciated the settlement houses and the services that they provided, but they weren't entirely trustful of the motives of the reformers, and so didn't really sort of jump on 100%. As urban population shot up after the Civil War, you also see new patterns of leisure emerging and amusement, most notably among the sort of urban working class. Leisure time took on increasing importance as factory work became increasingly routinized and impersonal. A lot of activities appealed to both men and women, but there were others that attracted more of one than the other. City streets provided recreation that anyone could afford. They offered great avenues for anything as simple as people watching. There were often street musicians or organ grinders that could attract your attention, vendors that would sell food and drinks. And in the summertime, when the heat inside the apartments at the tenements could be absolutely unbearable, the streets were sort of the hive of neighborhood social life and activity, because it was far more pleasant to be outside than it was to be inside. There were, however, other institutions that drew a mainly male clientele. Saloons, for example, offered the opportunity for companionship and conviviality, 5-cent beer, and quite often a free lunch. As neighborhood gathering places, they also reinforced group identity and became the centers for immigrant politics. Saloon keepers often doubled as ward bosses. And so not only had kind of control of the sort of localized political machinery, but also provided small services in order to instill loyalty, like finding them jobs or writing letters for those who were illiterate. Prostitution and crime flourished in some of the rougher establishments, but the pervasiveness of alcoholism generally in society was quite devastating, as quite often drunken husbands would squander their wages, quite frequently beat their wives or their children, and also would lose jobs due to heavy dependence on alcoholism, and actually prompted the arranging of groups like temperance unions and so on. Professional sports also became a very popular pastime. Americans didn't actually invent the game of baseball, as you will quite often hear, but in 1845 they were responsible for the formation of the first organized baseball team, and presumably shortly thereafter the much more important formation of the second baseball team, as one team alone is somewhat useless. And they were also popular for the popularization of the game, or at least the American form of baseball. Similar forms of sports had existed in places like England prior to this period, but America definitely, by the 1860s, had pretty much taken hold of the idea of baseball anyways. Promoters organized professional clubs and also began to charge admission for games and to compete for players. And by 1890, baseball was big business. Although it attracted a national following, with all social classes enjoying it, the working class took it particularly to heart. However much it helped to solidify ethnic groups, it also helped to foster a good deal of discrimination against Black Americans. For over a decade, players played on integrated teams. But in 1887, the Chicago White Stockings refused to play a team with a black pitcher. And this pretty much marked a turning point as far as the sport went with race relations. Colored baseball clubs began opening up soon thereafter, and increasingly black players were barred from any professional teams at all. The newspapers also loved baseball. In fact, Joseph Pulitzer introduced the first separate sports page when he bought the New York World in 1883. And although it was the biggest sport, there were other sports like horse racing and boxing that also attracted crowds, and especially people hoping to place wagers. Boxing aroused a much more passionate following among laborers, as matches became a testing ground where men could demonstrate their toughness and physicality. Horse racing also tended to be the purview of the kind of upper classes, the middle class, and so on. While saloons and prize fights would cater almost exclusively to a male audience, entertainments like vaudeville, amusement parks, and dance halls welcomed all comers. Vaudeville, which is a type of theatrical entertainment, evolved out of the antebellum minstrel shows, which quite often featured white performers in blackface. Vaudeville shows would occasionally also include skits with white performers in blackface, but they also included a wide variety of other entertainments like animal routines, musical interludes, comic skits, ventriloquists, pantomimes, magicians, and usually ended with what was called a flash finale, which include acrobatic feats of people like trapeze artists and the like. Skits and vaudeville plays quite often satirized local news, politics, the police force, things that everyone would recognize from everyday life, and so provided a kind of psychological escape from everyday life. Amusement parks, on the other hand, offered a physical escape from everyday life. Coney Island was probably the most famous at the time, and it evolved as a sort of resort for the masses in the 1870s. In amusement parks like Coney Island, young couples could go dancing, they could ride through darkened tunnels of love, They could speed down roller coasters or watch belly dancers and other carnival sideshows. For the kind of army of low-paid young working women that were emerging in growing numbers in the cities, amusement parks exerted a very powerful lure. They could meet friends at the parks. They could spend some unchaperoned time with young men. They could show off new dresses and outfits, try out the latest dance steps, or anything like that. Often, again, away from the watchful gaze of a chaperone. Nothing illustrated the sharp differences between middle and working class culture more so than the contrasting styles of popular music. The middle class tended to prefer things like hymns, while the working class tended to prefer music like ragtime. Ragtime was a specific musical style and combined syncopated rhythms, complex harmonies with sort of marching band musical structures. And I have a sample of it here. The sample currently playing in the background is one that you might recognize. It's called the Maple Leaf Rag. And it was composed by Scott Joplin, who was one of the better known composers of this type of music in the period in question. Even in the upper and middle classes, Victorian morality and cultural standards were never completely accepted. In the 1870s and 80s, a group of upper class writers and editors codified a set of standards for literature and the arts and campaigned to improve American taste in things like interior design, textiles, ceramics, wallpaper, and even books. By creating these rigorous standards, they hoped to also create a coherent national artistic culture. In the 1880s, they set up new guidelines for serious literature, lecturing the middle class about the value of high culture and the insights to be gained from painting and music. The growing interest in art for art's sake paralleled the broader crusade called the aesthetic movement, which sought to bring art into every facet of life. However, the extreme elitism that tended to characterize this idea and the desire to control the nation's literary standards soon aroused some very notable opposition. Mark Twain, for example, spoke for many young writers when he declared that he was through with the literature and all that bosh, which is obviously a direct quote. Twain and like-minded others explored new forms of fiction and worked to broaden the appeal to the general public. By doing this, they charted new directions for American literature and rested on fundamental changes taking place in publishing as well. You have coming onto the scene in this period new, cheaper magazines, which doubled or tripled the circulation traditionally seen by periodicals, and supported themselves with advertising, and so they could be sold at a lower price rather than supporting themselves on circulation alone. These publications encouraged new trends in fiction, while mass marketing for new products as well. They wanted writers that could provide accurate depictions of real life. The writers who fed this need became known as regionalists because they would capture distinctive dialect and details of local environments, or they might be called realists because of their focus on truthful depictions of the commonplace. Or some were even called naturalists because they sought to deny the influence of free will and focus on how outcomes are quite often determined by economic and psychological forces. These three are listed as distinct categories, although quite often the borders between them were blurred. And you would have some individuals who would write one work that was much more naturalist and then write something that might be considered more regionalist. And so no one fell completely into one category or another. Growing numbers of scholars and critics similarly challenged the sort of self-serving certitudes of Victorian mores, including assumptions that moral worth and economic standing were closely linked and represented a social order that had been decreed by both God and nature alike. Challenges to genteel tradition also found very strong support among architects and painters. Architects followed the lead of Louis Sullivan, who argued that a building's form should follow its function. These architects looked not to the past for the inspiration for their designs, but rather to the future in a movement that became known as modernism. Modernism, with its rejection of Victorian refinement, also affected American art and painting as well. Some of the more notable artists, Winslow Homer, for example, served as a magazine illustrator during the Civil War and used his paintings after that to reveal the brutality and unsentimental nature of nature itself. And so quite often you see scenes depicted where it is essentially a variation on the theme of man against nature. Thomas Eakins' canvases also captured moments of exertion in everyday life. The exertion could be physical, it could be mental, and quite often depended on what the subject matter was. But it was always very unromantic, unvarnished, if you like. Mary Cassatt, who was another famous American realist in this period, was also interested in the everyday, but she often focused her attention on the bond between mother and child. Her paintings look somewhat different from the other two, as Cassatt lived primarily in Paris and so was influenced by French Impressionists who were active in Paris in the period. The revolt by architects and painters was also symbolic of a larger shift in middle-class thought. This resulted from fundamental economic changes that spawned a far more complex social environment than had existed previously. Although they distrusted the idealistic Victorian assumptions about social progress, new middle-class journalists and novelists and artists and so on remained somewhat divided on how exactly to replace them, and it wasn't really until the progressive era takes hold at the turn of the century that you really see any concrete ideas as far as that's concerned. I have here a collection of paintings by the three artists that I mentioned earlier. The painting in the bottom right-hand corner is one done by Winslow Homer, and this is a group of boys who are sailing on the seas, probably off the coast of Maine, as that is where Homer was residing when he did most of his work like this. Again, you see some suggestion of the idea of man against nature, which is essentially any outdoor activity like sailing. The object of man is to stay afloat, and arguably the object of choppy waves and things like that is to wreck you. And so there you see some idea of man against nature. The larger picture on the left is a image by Thomas Eakins, and this is called The Gross Clinic. In some way, you also get a sense of man against nature, although it's not quite as obvious, perhaps. But it shows a dissection, an anatomy lecture, essentially. In medical schools at the time, it was very uncommon that a medical student would get to sort of do their own dissections on a human body while they were in school. And quite often, a lot of times, doctors had any real sort of experience with this type of thing was on their actual patients, because they didn't do it in medical school. And the reason for that was that bodies were quite often in short supply. And so in order to get the anatomy without doing it themselves, they would do anatomy lectures where the instructor would do the dissection, and the medical students would sit in a kind of stadium style seating Usually it was a kind of round room with a dissection table in the middle, and there would be sort of stadium-style tables and chairs that were stacked, as you can kind of see in the background there, so that everybody could see what was going on down on the table. I mentioned that this is still a portrayal of man against nature, in that it's man attempting to discern what nature has created, to discover the secrets of the human body, which you can see portrayed in quite explicit detail by Eakins. Eakins was quite famous for his ability to realistically portray the human form as well, and he worked very hard to really figure out the human form in order to realistically portray it. The last photograph in the top right is one by Mary Cassatt. I mentioned that her artistic style was different from the other two, and you can see that here, the brushstrokes and things like that, much more indicative of the Impressionists than the other two, which are far more precise. However, you can also see here, I mentioned that her focus was on the bond between mother and child quite often, and here you can see a mother and daughter doing what a mother and daughter in Paris might have done on any given afternoon, I suppose, enjoying a sort of lazy float in a pond and remarking on some ducks and perhaps even feeding them. All of these fall into the sort of category of realism because they aren't particularly romantic, I suppose, in the subject matter. It's not sort of sweeping vistas or historical epic type scenes that we would get in the Romantic era. But anyways, it's very realistic. It's very ordinary in that sense. Presumably, if one were a realist painter were to paint the image of Washington crossing the Delaware, which we looked at when we talked about Romanticism, his painting might look rather different. It might, in fact, depict them in the dead of night. They would all be sort of sat huddled in the boats. Washington would be unremarkable. There wouldn't be any giant sort of flag being held aloft or anything like that. And so it's interesting to consider what the picture would have looked like in this period, given the attitudes to art and this period compared to the previous one, which is Romanticism. Although middle-class women figured quite prominently in the revolt against Victorian refinement, their role was still somewhat ambiguous. Although many women chafed at the restrictions, they nonetheless remained committed to playing the sort of nurturing role within the family. Early advocates proposed a widened sphere rather than a completely different sphere or a complete destruction of the spheres altogether. This widened sphere for women would combine the traditional Victorian role with things like expanded political action. And the formation of groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union are an excellent example of this. This idea, or this group, relies on the idea that women are inherently compassionate and nurturing, and inherently have a greater moral compass, I suppose, than men do as well. And these tendencies make them the perfect political advocates for something like temperance. And so they're taking characteristics that are traditionally endowed to women and jobs like nurturing and being the moral compass that are traditionally reserved for women, and expanding them from just the home to a wider social sphere. While older women used groups like that to challenge the Victorian ideal, younger women challenged it by joining into the bicycle craze of the late 19th century. The bicycle was developed as part of a new interest in health and physical fitness, and Americans explored various ways to improve their vigor. In response to this, some of them used health products like cod liver oil or sarsaparilla. Others took up activities like basketball, but bicycling was by far the most appealing, as it could be done alone or in groups, and it combined leisure and exercise in a very sort of pleasing way. This was especially appealing to women who disliked the restricted attitudes about female exercise and so embraced bicycling. They also embraced the fashions, the new fashions that came with bicycling, which often included sort of split skirts, which were much easier for mobility and general movement. Changing attitudes about femininity and women's proper roles also found expression in the shifting ideas about marriage. One lady, at the time Charlotte Perkins Gilman, argued that women would make an effective contribution to society only when they won economic independence from men through work outside the home. One tangible indicator of the changing relationship to men was the substantial rise in the divorce rate. Despite efforts, attitudes changed very slowly. The enlarged conception of women's roles had the greatest influence on college-educated middle-class women, who had quite often greater leisure time and reasonable expectation of success in areas like journalism, social work, or nursing. The ideas being put forth by these very early feminists remained much more of an abstract goal for working class women whose majority of their time was taken up with simply attempting to survive. Controversy over the scope and function of public education also engaged Americans on all levels of society, and also tended to highlight the class and cultural divisions that characterized the late 19th century. Middle-class educators often saw public schools as an instrument for both indoctrinating and controlling the lower ranks of society, and so campaigned to expand public schooling and to centralize control of it. This movement brought out considerable opposition from ethnic and religious groups. The crusade for public education began in the antebellum period by Horace Mann, and this meant that most states already had a functioning public school system. However, most students only attended for 3 or 4 years at most, and very few went on to do secondary education. Gilded Age reformers feared that students would not be sufficiently educated to either participate effectively in public affairs or the labor force, especially as labor was becoming far more technical, machine-orientated, and so worked to increase the number of years that students had to attend school. They elaborated a philosophy of public education that stressed punctuality, centralized administration, compulsory attendance, and a tenure system that would protect teachers from both political as well as parental pressure. This idea very quickly prompted protests from a number of different groups. One New York pediatrician criticized the system that stressed memorization and prison-like discipline, but he tended to overlook in his criticisms any advances that were made in reading and maths, which were actually fairly substantial. Several different groups also found themselves in opposition to this new philosophy. Those that depended on their children's wages to help support their families fervently disliked the idea of taking the children out in order to put them in schools where they wouldn't be making a wage to support the family. Catholic immigrants protested the Protestant indoctrination of the schools, and so quite often set up their own parochial schools to handle their own education needs. Upper-class parents didn't particularly like the idea of sending their children to immigrant-thonged public schools, and so quite often sent their daughters to female seminaries and their sons to boarding schools as well. Overall, school enrollments dramatically expanded during the period, despite the several feuds over ethnic and class differences that were exposed as a result.